Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try to speak quite quickly about just one aspect of why governments want to put the legal frameworks in place, why people might want to take these types of tenure, and what the problems are. But also, very much what the positive benefits are to government. As you all know, many or most countries have only a few tenures. Some only two: owner occupation and renting. Others have a wider range with co-ops and in particular leases. But in all countries, if you think about what the fundamentals of tenure are, we have enormous gaps in the possibilities of tenure. Now, is that because the ones which we've got are obviously the best? Well, as we've all got different ones, possibly that is not the case. And certainly each country thinks what they've got is the sensible one for them. And then if you talk, for instance, as we often do, about leasehold, where urban Britain has run on leasehold for 100 years, other countries look at us as though we're completely mad. So there are some fundamental attributes, and it's important to understand those attributes. But it's also important to understand why government might want to be involved. I'm not going to talk about the types of intermediate tenure because there are so very many. But fundamentally, as Carlos said, they come down to joint ownership, where nobody owns 100% of the property, at least until one buys the other out, or equity mortgages, where other organizations, institutions, and government provide finance, but expect their return in the form of asset increases, like capital gains, rather than in the form of interest. And then there are specialist non-debt products, which are Sharia compliant and which are based on a more complex ideas of how we pay for the asset without incurring any debt in that process. And there's also a lot of rental products. But there are so many, and they've all got particular attributes. That is not the core of what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is why government should be involved in them, and whether there is evidence that government benefits from this process. Because I may be cynical, but I don't think government does anything unless they get something out of it. And improving access and affordability to home ownership is what they say they're trying to do. And that has two aspects. One is it right that people should be being supported into home ownership rather than into other tenures? But it also has in it the second one, which is that government is trying to limit the subsidies which they have to pay to ensure affordable housing, and they're trying to raise additional private finance. Because if there isn't a mechanism for individuals to put their own equity in, then government has to support a larger proportion of the stock. The third possibility is that they are trying, as with legal frameworks in particular, to address market failures. And I think Spain is very atypical in the sense that they do this first and then get round to actually operating it, in the sense that this Catalonian legislation has been years in the making, while we just get on with it and then sort out the problems afterwards. And sometimes the problems can't be sorted that way. Then there are market reasons. There are reasons for the individual, that if you are debt financed, if you've got a very high loan-to-value ratio, you are exposed to a lot of risk. You're exposed to the risk that the value of the property will go down, but you're also exposed to risks about the payments and credit and your unemployment, etc. And so there are reasons why shared ownership, shared equity can enable that risk to be either shared or transferred. And those are distinct reasons, and transferring often does involve the government. And then there's the possibility, very much into the longer term, that having a wider range of tenures which fit people's positions better could help to stabilise markets and stop people aiming to continue to speculate, make capital gains, etc. That is a sort of long-run view, but in terms of the story of government, it can be about offsetting the government's own stupidities, in a sense. If government is going to generate a macroeconomy in which there is volatility, then they have to generate mechanisms for addressing that volatility. And finally, the one I think I'll spend at least 2 minutes on is supporting mixed communities, which is, I think, one of the few areas where there is positives on everybody's side. So the experience in a range of countries is all individual to their country, all based on the institutions of that country. But the vast majority of products in this range have been government-sponsored, and traditionally they've been aimed at people who haven't got the money to go into owner-occupation easily, but are better off than the state wants to provide social housing for. So they are a way of limiting subsidy. And it's a self-serving operation on the part of government, and we should always be concerned about what we're paying for that in many different ways. Is to bring their own individuals' equity in, and that has two benefits. One, of course, it reduces what government has to do, but the second is that it gets the person involved in that property, involved in that community. And that is, I think, a significant aspect of it. It improves affordability, and it helps to meet the aspirations for ownership, which are very strong in many countries. And fundamentally, if that works, and people pay off their mortgages before they stop working, then it reduces housing costs in the time when government might have to pay more. So there are enormous benefits. But the products which governments have used have, in the main, not addressed the risks to the owner-occupier, to the people taking these products. They've usually ended up with very high debt ratios and a large specific asset, which has a lot of possible volatility around it and risk around it. If the market worked better, and that of course depends upon getting the legal framework, then we could develop risk-sharing and risk-reducing products in the market. A number of countries sitting here, a number of people sitting here have worked on these. They're Australia, Netherlands, Britain. They have big potential benefits because they both allow tenants to get involved in owning housing assets, which any portfolio management would want to happen, and they allow owner-occupiers not to be tied to a single product in the way that they normally are. As I say, no financial advisor would ever suggest to somebody that they should have 40 or 50% of their assets in a single specific unit. But the legal and the market failures have been extreme, and there are very few examples of market products which work. But where I do think that it has worked, and it's worked perhaps by mistake, as is often the case when governments are involved, is in the context of regeneration and in mixed communities. Governments are in many regeneration areas, maybe most, maybe I'm talking too country specific, but I think not. Governments and their policies are often a major source of uncertainty in deprived and regenerating areas. Yes, there's positives, they're trying to get something done, they've got a 20-year plan. What government stays constant for 20 years and has the funding available for 20 years? There's always a lot of complications around that process. And these are often government-inspired risks. And if that's the case, then government should be paying some of the costs of those risks. And one way of doing that is to share the ownership, so that if government does something stupid, then they have at least some costs associated with doing that stupidity. But equally, if they do it well, they get some of the benefits back. And the people who are living in the homes get good homes, good communities, and, or potentially anyway, and don't have to bear all the risks. So I think that this is the strongest case for government-inspired, sponsored home ownership, or shared ownership, shared equity, whichever. And in this context, in Britain, the emphasis has been particularly strong on mixed communities, on when we are redeveloping regeneration areas, what we don't want is to then find that you are replicating the poverty and the deprivation of that area. You want to get a situation where there's the potential for the area to take off in terms of people as well as in terms of the physical infrastructure. So one of the ways of ensuring a mix of households, types and incomes is actually to have a mix of tenures. And this has been a really important outcome of the shared ownership and equity share products in England. And I think can be regarded as one of the success stories, at least in the short run. The long run may be different, but the short run, it has generated mixed communities, it's generated successful private partnerships, it has generated additional private finance, and it has generated reduced subsidy, though there's still the problem of the equity risk. And just to give you an example, which I'm sure you can't read, but basically we did a study of what was happening as a result of new build in the social rented sector and in the intermediate tenures. And what it shows is that in terms of the social tenants coming into these areas, they fundamentally look like social tenants everywhere. They have the same basic attributes. They are poor, they tend not to be in work, they are either quite young or quite old, and they may have been homeless, and they have children, because most of our priorities are around children. But when you move to who comes and lives next door to them in a shared ownership or shared equity product, then the answer is you get much younger people, far fewer children, which means that the mix in the overall area is, the child density is more easy to manage in the short run and hopefully into the longer run. But most importantly, you get 90–95% of working households, and working households who've got a commitment to their equity in their own home and therefore an involvement in that community. So you wouldn't get that mixed income without a mechanism such as intermediate tenure, and you wouldn't get it without it being government sponsored. So to that extent, I think there is another reason for it, which is not just the legal and market failure story. So the conclusion, very quickly, is that there are many good reasons, which I've written about and many people in this audience have, about why there should be more tenures around than there are. They do have costs of setting up, they do have costs of transparency and understanding and so on. And they have proved very difficult to develop without government assistance, which is not surprising because all the countries here have got well embedded a system which works but has its costs. And over the last few years, those costs have been very strong in terms of the risk to the individuals. But there's particularly good reasons, self-serving reasons why government wants to be involved, and that's basically it can save them money and it can make better communities into the longer run. But if they don't know what their objectives are, they tend to develop the wrong products. And that, I think, is the current situation. You haven't got as far as the product yet. Thank you very much.